Many common misconceptions about the nature of freedom, what constitutes choice, and what freedom does not confer are among the long-term consequences of a borderline psychotic social revolution of the 1960s and 1970s. Few people today understand what freedom is or how to define it. They believe that freedom gives them unrestricted freedom to do whatever they want. However, that kind of belief is not a definition of freedom. Rather, it is a definition of unlimited egocentrism, license, or unlimited freedom of action. It is not the foundation of a free society. Rather, it is a recipe for tyranny. Mabuhay. This is Owen. Welcome to another session on freedom, in which we are going to understand better the very nature of freedom. This lesson will be focusing on freedom in the context of choices and consequences. This lesson will explain to us that freedom is not all about having the privilege of unrestricted choosing, that in every act of choosing consequences are formed. Also, this lesson intends us to exercise prudence in choices, realize that choices have consequences and that there are trade-offs in making choices, show situations that demonstrate freedom of choice, and the consequences of their choices. To open this lesson, allow me to present to you the questions that will facilitate the understanding of the main concepts of the lesson. Bear these questions in mind and try to answer them as we along with the lesson. 1. What is freedom in its context, its kinds, and its principles? 2. What is freedom in the context of choosing? 3. Why is freedom good when seen in the light of the consequences of choices? 4. How do we assert freedom in a responsible and beneficial manner? Before dealing with the undeniable relationship of freedom on choices and consequences, it is very significant to lay open for better understanding the nature of freedom. The nature of freedom in this topic is grounded on the contexts of freedom, kinds of freedom, and basic principles on freedom. To gain more knowledge on the nature of freedom, let us begin our discussion with the two contexts which will clarify us on how on the views on freedom as suggested by Isaiah Berlin. We all react at times aggressively to freedom, and under its banner, revolutions have begun, wars have been fought, and political campaigns are ongoing. But what do we mean by freedom? The fact that politicians from all political parties claim to believe in freedom suggests that people don't always mean the same thing when they say it. Could there be different kinds of freedom, and if so, could they conflict with one another? Could promoting one type of freedom limit another? Could people be coerced in the name of liberty? Isaiah Berlin, a 20th-century political philosopher, thought the answer to both questions was yes. And in his essay Two Concepts of Liberty, he distinguished two contexts of freedom or liberty. Berlin used the terms interchangeably, which he called negative freedom and positive freedom. Negative freedom is the absence of interference, the absence of coercion. You are negatively free in the sense that others do not limit what you can do. If other people prevent you from doing something, either directly or indirectly by supporting social and economic arrangements that disadvantage you, they limit your negative freedom to that extent. Berlin emphasizes that only restrictions imposed by others count as limitations on one's freedom. Natural causes of restrictions do not count. My inability to levitate is a physical limitation, not a limitation of my freedom. As opposed to negative freedom, positive freedom is the ability to control oneself. It illustrates self-rule or self-mastery. Being positively free means being one's own master, acting rationally and responsibly in accordance with one's interests. This may appear to be the inverse of negative freedom. I control myself to the extent that no one else controls me. As it is the nature of freedom, both contexts of freedom present limits for the individual's sake. Also, negative freedom and positive freedom affect each other. The limits and impact of these contexts of freedom can be seen in a situation of trade-offs. Trade-off happens when upholding one context of freedom, the other freedom is being restricted or limited. In the case that the state sets rules and regulation presents trade-off. It is a fact that if we are to avoid chaos, We must accept some limitations on our negative freedom. All states require their citizens to abide by laws and regulations designed to help them coexist and keep society running smoothly. We accept these limitations on our liberty in exchange for other benefits such as peace, security, and prosperity. Trade-off on freedom can also occur on an individual case because of the gap which may form between positive and negative freedom, since a person may lack self-control even when not restrained by others. Consider a drug addict who is unable to break the habit that is killing him. Even though his negative freedom is not limited, he is not positively free, that is, acting rationally in his own best interests. No one is forcing him to take the drug. In such cases, Berlin observes, it is natural to speak of two selves, a lower self that is irrational and impulsive, and a higher self that is rational and foresighted. And it is suggested that a person is only positively free if his higher self is dominant. If this is correct, we may be able to make someone more free by coercing him. If we keep the addict from using drugs, we may be able to help his higher self regain control. We would increase his positive freedom by limiting his negative freedom. Since freedom is intrinsic to man, freedom is linked to the nature of man as a holistic person. Thus, freedom is categorized into physical freedom, psychological freedom, and moral freedom. Physical freedom. The absence of any physical restraint is referred to as physical freedom. The individual has the freedom to go wherever he or she wants. He or she is not restrained by physical force in his or her actions. Given the person's natural limitations, physical freedom allows him or her to act and move as desired. You cannot be everywhere at the same time, but your freedom allows you to move from one location to another and go wherever you want. Psychological freedom. Psychological freedom entails the ability to make choices, be creative, and be self-aware. Every human being has the right to self-development in order to achieve self-actualization. He or she is not prevented from growing into the best person he or she can be for himself or herself and others. The ability to be free lies not in the ability to say yes to everything, but in the ability to say yes only to what truly matters to you, and that you have determined is beneficial to you, and everyone else. Moral freedom. Moral freedom is defined as exercising freedom in a way that upholds human dignity and goodness. When a person uses freedom well, he or she becomes more free. When he or she misuses it, he or she becomes less free. Humans have a natural desire for what is true and good, and when someone uses their freedom to commit acts that violate human dignity and goodness, they dehumanize themselves and effectively negate human freedom. This discussion on the kinds of freedom points out that freedom affects the totality of the human person, and that freedom is universal to all. Having discussed about the contexts of freedom and kinds of freedom, let us discuss the basic principles on the nature of freedom. Freedom is essential to humanity's existence, however asserting it effectively needs wisdom. To do such, it is best to start to have the grasp of its basic principles. 1. Freedom is an intrinsic and essential property of the person. This means that the human person by nature is a free being and that it is in his or her nature to seek freedom. Only the human person has the power to be what he or she wants to be and the ability to decide and create for himself or herself. As such, man is bound to freedom as long as he or she lives. 2. Freedom is rooted in the human person's self-determination and the exercise of intellect and free will. This principle emphasizes key factors where freedom emanates. These are self-determination, intellect, and free will. Take note that these are natural to humans. This is the nature of self-determination, that is, the person's actions determine what kind of person he or she becomes. These actions were determined not by instinct but by human intellect, and decided to be acted because of the free will. 3. Freedom is experienced through the act of making choices. Although human freedom allows us to consider countless decisions and actions, we can only choose to carry out one of these actions or decisions. The ability to choose and carry out a course of action does not imply that we should do so every time. It is also possible that in a given situation, the decision not to act is an acceptable and moral choice. To have the full glimpse of the nature of freedom, it is imperative to take the principles of freedom as interconnected body of knowledge. Looking at the contexts and principles of freedom, one can conclude that choosing is the assertion of freedom. Freedom is made manifested by man through his or her ability to choose. When choosing or deciding, two elements of freedom manifest. These are awareness and responsibility. The first element of freedom is awareness that is wired in consciousness. People's ability to make life-affirming decisions is directly related to their level of awareness. The more self-aware people are about why they do what they do, how they truly feel, what their needs are, and so on, the more options they have in any situation. For those who are less aware, the options available to them are much more limited. However, recognizing people's limitations in terms of choice does not absolve them of responsibility for the consequences of their actions. Everyone is responsible for what they create, regardless of their level of awareness. The second important element of freedom is responsibility. Responsibility refers to the person being accountable for his or her actions and their consequences. Having the awareness of your choices and decisions means the person making those choices has the responsibility to accept and live those consequences. Freedom means freedom for everybody. Freedom does not mean one person has the right to do what he or she wants, then force the responsibility for the consequences and mess upon other people. That is not freedom, but is license and criminality. With consideration on freedom as a responsibility, choices and decisions have consequences. Most may think that freedom is not any more a privilege but a burden to bear. The question then becomes, what good is freedom? The value of freedom in general, or of any specific freedom, is entirely dependent on how it is used wisely. The value of freedom to any individual is only as good as the individual's judgment. Making choices and freedom necessitates the use of judgment. Freedom, when used wisely, is advantageous. Unwise use of freedom is either useless or destructive. It is pointless to use freedom to engage in actions that, by definition, have chaotic or destructive outcomes. Consequences dictate how freedom should be exercised. Consequences determine which choices should be made wisely when given the freedom to choose. The mere existence of an option does not negate its consequences. That does not necessarily make that option wise. Reality is imposing consequences. Once a choice has been made, the actions play out, and the consequences delivered. We have to live with those consequences. Freedom requires realistic, honest evaluation of the consequences of decisions and choices. Freedom is manifested on the ability of the human person to choose consciously and that choices have consequences. This calls for being prudent on making choices. As such, the question is, how do we assert our freedom in responsible and beneficial manner? 1. Freedom can be exercised in responsible and beneficial manner by having control and a recognition of reasonable limits. We limit our own freedom by learning to moderate or control our thoughts, emotions, and actions based on the circumstances. A person can even choose to limit or even give up his or her freedom in exchange for greater benefits. Despite being first in line, a person may choose not to enter the jeepney in order to give way to an elderly woman. A young professional may choose not to speak up in a meeting about serious concerns about a worker, instead confronting the individual in private. You may be angry at your teacher for scolding you in front of the entire class, but you avoided responding to him or her because it would be considered disrespectful. Citizens may be angry about government corruption, but they do not take to the streets and engage in violence just to vent their rage. Instead, they find more reasonable and legal ways to express themselves. Limiting our personal freedom necessitates the sacrifice of certain self-interests and the acceptance of certain realities over which we have no control. You have the option to pursue a degree in medicine, but because your parent cannot afford to send you to medical school, you choose a less expensive course. Our sense of right and wrong helps us recognize and decide on the boundaries of our freedom. Our society also restricts our individual liberties. From determining where we can cross the street to controlling our actions through laws and regulations, society imposes reasonable limits on personal freedom in order to maintain order and harmony in the public's welfare. 2. Freedom can be asserted in a responsible and beneficial manner by exercising freedom with regard for knowledge and truth. It is natural for us to think before we act, since we are rational beings. We use our freedom to act and gain more knowledge, and we use this knowledge to make decisions and plan courses of action when faced with difficult situations. A student should study and prepare ahead of time to know the correct information needed to answer a multiple-choice item on an exam. Otherwise, he or she will be unable to correctly answer the test. The ability to obtain information and accurate knowledge about a specific situation is critical, because it allows us to make wise and informed decisions. For example, when voting for student council officials, some students may choose to vote for candidates they know and like, or even candidates they find attractive or appealing. More discerning students, on the other hand, will research each candidate's positions on critical school issues and vote based on their assessment of who is the best candidate to address these concerns. True knowledge is also required for people who want to invest in business ventures to determine whether they are engaging in legitimate transactions or being duped into participating in a scam. It is difficult to gather the necessary information before deciding on the best course of action, but it is a necessary step to ensure that our choices, decisions, and actions are proper, reasonable, and just. If we make a decision based on inaccurate or incomplete information, we may end up making decisions that harm ourselves and others. As a result, we must cultivate the intellectual virtue of prudence to serve as our guide in making sound decisions. 3. Freedom can be asserted in a responsible and beneficial manner by recognizing and upholding not only individual freedom but also the freedom of others. This viewpoint has resulted in the claim that freedom is a recognized and guaranteed right for all people. Many societies identify certain freedoms that should be enjoyed by all, because they contribute to the individual's quality of life and the welfare of society. Freedom to live and determine one's identity, freedom from slavery and other constraints, freedom of speech and freedom of thought, conscience, and religion are among these. Freedom should be exercised with due regard for the welfare of others, and one's freedom should be exercised as a means to enable others to fully enjoy their own freedom, rather than as a tool to restrict the freedom of others. To conclude this lesson, let us remember the following key points of the lesson. 1. Freedom, according to Isaiah Berlin, has two contexts, namely negative freedom and positive freedom, in which the connection and limits of these contexts of freedom create trade-offs. Also, freedom is physical, psychological, and moral, since man is a holistic being. As such, the nature of freedom can be synthesized through the following principles. Freedom is intrinsic to man. Freedom is rooted in the human person's self-determination and the exercise of intellect and free will. And freedom is experienced through the act of making choices. 2. Choosing is the assertion of freedom, in which it composes of awareness and responsibility. 3. The consequences of our choices encourage us to be prudent when asserting our freedom. 4. To exercise freedom in a responsible and beneficial manner, one must exercise freedom with control and a recognition of reasonable limits, and engage freedom by recognizing and upholding not only individual freedom but also the freedom of others. Mabuhay. This is Owen, reminding you to be sensible in utilizing your freedom.